Okay.
Just for the sake of the English films, I'll do welcoming in Dutch, man. No worries. I will take it. Welkom iedereen. Ik ga ook in Nederland zijn. We zijn met een heel gemengde groep. Nogal wat Britten hier zijn vanavond. Dus na een korte verwelkoming moet ik onmiddellijk in het Engels verder gaan. Voilà, en hier is een korte verwelkoming ook gebeurd. But it's a very short welcome in English. So welcome everybody, and the second of the 4 talks we're having in Ieper. I was calculating because we already had 2. This is the third. Yeah. Third in Ieper. Yeah. It's the third in Ieper. See, getting old, too many drinks perhaps. But anyway, it's an old friend we're having over, in the person of Tim. Tim, who is actually an architectural historian and an artist in his own right, but we will not talk about his art tonight, but he might later on with a drink. Very happy to talk about that. But about his research, and his research focuses on the cemeteries and their relationship to the landscape, in which the cemeteries came into being. And as an architectural historian, Tim has actually focused not just on the British war cemeteries, but on the so-called junior architects of the war cemeteries, junior architects who quite often had a past, or in all cases, I don't know, had a past as a veteran who had served in the war, so that made a difference with the principal architects. Tim obtained his PhD in 2020, something like that?
I think so, yeah. Sounds about right.
Just before COVID, you did your PhD at the COVID, right? Something like that. Especially on that subject, and I think Mark, you were one of the supervisors? Mm-hmm. That's right. And so now I think this is also a small part of all the research you've done now?
Different part entirely.
Different part, that's right. Wow, that's something new then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lovely, thank you. Should just pop that on. Well, thank you for that, Dominic. And thank you all for coming out on a very grey and wet Flanders evening. It's lovely to see so many faces. For those of you that don't know, as Dominic has mentioned earlier, my thesis was looking at the cemeteries of the Great War, particularly the British cemeteries. And whilst the PhD takes a certain number of years, actually the cemeteries have been of interest to me for 25 years now, since I first started coming out here. And one of the questions that very early on kind of came to me was, why is it that I feel so comfortable coming back into a cemetery space? What is it about these spaces that ostensibly are places that house dead people? Why do I feel a sense of home and a sense of place when I come back to them? And although I didn't really expand on that necessarily in my thesis, it never really gone away as a question. And so I thought I'd take the opportunity this evening to explore some of the elements that I think have made that create the sense of place in these spaces. So the way the talk will go will be, I think it's important that we kind of establish a little bit of what Englishness might mean in the context of the creation of these cemeteries, and then go through a few of the ways in which the architecture presents this type of Englishness, and look at a few of the different cemeteries that show these things. But to first look at Englishness, I think it's pretty important to first caveat the whole thing by saying, when I'm talking about Englishness, I'm really talking about the interchangeability of Britishness and Englishness at the time of the creation of these cemeteries. And that Englishness is meant to be representative of everyone, but is distinctly influenced by England and English elements. Now the cartoon on the screen there is something very early on in my PhD research. I came across this cartoon. I really wanted to use it in it, but I never got the opportunity to, because as anyone that's done any kind of lengthy academic study will find, it went in a very different direction very quickly. So I never got to use it, so I finally get to use it tonight. And it really captures something about ideas of Englishness. It's also a theme that was picked up in the propaganda posters of the time. It's the England that's being fought for. And in this case, Clough Williams Ellis, who was an officer in the Tank Corps during the war, who goes on to help form what is the Council for the Protection of Rural England, and writes this book, England and the Octopus, which is about the defence of the English rural landscape, and the fear that urbanisation is sweeping across the landscape and we're losing the country that was fought for. And this kind of theme of protectionism is quite a common theme in the interwar years. You have the CPRE emerge, you also have the growth of institutions like the National Trust, and you also, beyond these institutions, you have the kind of artistic gaze of the interwar years turns inward to look back at Britain as well. And part of that is a reaction to this war, and part of it is the cloud of the coming war that drives the gaze inward. So you have the artists like Eric Ravilius, the Nash brothers, John Piper, etc., are focused on Englishness and English landscape. But what's the kind of central theme in all of this is England as rural. You can see in the cartoon, the rural England is the one they're fighting for, and isn't it a disgrace that he's come back to urban England? And that is despite the fact that 80% of the population are living in an urban environment at the time. We have this idyll of rural England, which becomes kind of central to the idea of England and thus Englishness. And when I was thinking about this in the context of the cemeteries, I was kind of mulling over what was the potential connection between this idea of rural England and the way the cemeteries and cemetery spaces were designed. And as I was reading through, I came across, I should mention these as well. Part of that inward look is that the artists were created on. You see a number of books and series of books published at during the 20s and 30s, and going onwards into the 40s and 50s as well. These books that, in this case, the Batsford series, which all have these wonderful Brian Cook book covers on dust jackets. They look at specific elements, specific building types within the English landscape. So you have the country house, you have the English cottage, you have the village inn, parish churches, cathedrals, but they are all rural building types. You won't find the English factory. You won't find anything like that, anything that makes it too industrial. They are all focusing on this idea of rural England. You see that in this series. You also find it in things like Arthur Mee's The King's England, that focuses on the rural villages and the artistic elements of each of these villages, which are of historic interest or of some kind of design significance. And so that kind of artistic inward gaze that I mentioned is also being readily lapped up by the public buying these books. And it was these books in particular that led Roy Strong the former director of the V&A Museum, and famously the person who commissioned the three exhibitions in the 70s that defined the way that England thinks of its heritage, with the destruction of the country house, etc. Really kind of kick-started a movement towards the protection of our heritage again. And he wrote of these books. These books taught me that England's identity lay in her historic past, in the gentle rolling countryside, in ancient brick and stone manor houses, nestling amid parkland, in villages where houses gathered round a parish church whose tower dominated the terrain, a scene enlivened by a green, a pond and an inn. And I thought actually that pretty well captures the rural idyll. Roy Strong himself goes on to say this is a kind of it's a projection of rural England that isn't necessarily the case, but it's one that people would see as English and England and rural England at that. And within that there are a couple of key points, a couple of key elements that I mentioned. You've got the brick and stone manor houses, the parkland, and the churches, and some other elements with the pond, etc., that define each of these villages. And so I took that as a kind of a fairly useful starting point, this kind of reaction to the books of the period, that neatly in a single paragraph captured what this rural idyll was that was so prevalent as the idea of England within those the 20s and 30s. And that England is one that looked a bit like this. This is a drawing from a really fantastic book from just before the First World War. It's a whole catalogue of the various types of manor houses that you'll find in and around England, and they are all absolutely beautifully illustrated by Sidney Jones. Which is as an aside to this, Sidney Jones was also he was a Royal Engineer in 59th Division, and he wrote a book which could have been the title for the talk tonight. Actually, he wrote a book called England in France, but it just wasn't very apt for Ieper. So I stuck with what I went with. So this is the kind of vision of rural England that interested me in terms of the aesthetics of the War Graves Commission. And I would say as well, as a kind of another caveat, that this is about the visual connection between these spaces and what they are, that kind of what they're capturing in the framing of that architecture, not purely the architecture. In some cases it will be, but in other cases it's the atmosphere, the spirit of place that they create with the design. So apologies for it not being in Belgium, but the first cemetery is Kent-Ieper. And I think it's fairly clear to see the visual relationship between the two cemeteries straight off. So gate piers are obviously not only in England, but gate piers are a very, very strong element to rural life within England, and not just rural life, but also the hierarchy of rural life. And that's a really important element to the use of these kind of grand entrances to cemetery spaces. But we'll look a little bit at that later on. What I'd like to look at on this particular cemetery is the axis that's created as an entranceway. So the view that we have across the space from the gateway to the pavilion that houses the visitors' book. And what we have is a framing of Englishness as per the kind of manor house illustration we saw, but most importantly, from this angle, the graves and death is removed from the scene. So what you end up with, if you imagine standing where I was standing when I took this photograph, you're on foreign soil, looking into an English space that you then have to pass into before you turn right, and you are greeted with all the rows of headstones. So you have a transitional space between foreign and England before you're confronted with the rows of headstones. There's another detail with Carnoy. Well, there's a couple of details actually that are worth picking up on. One is the use of horticulture. So throughout the cemeteries we look at, it's not just the hard architecture of the brick and stone design. It's also the integration of the softer landscaping. And key in that, and indeed it causes a number of discussions early on in the design when they're establishing design principles, is the use of the lawn, which is seen as quintessentially English. And so the lawn becomes a quite important part in that scene. If I just pop back, you can just about see the kind of flat and rolled lawn, which is not as common in France and Belgium as it is within English garden design. So there's the lawns, there's also the use of trees to convey the rurality of it. And even within cemeteries within urban spaces, the planting is often still inspired by rural aesthetic rather than trying to tie in with the existing urban aesthetic around. And the other element to this particular cemetery, which is quite unusual actually within the War Graves Commission, is this device on the front of the piers. You'll often see the name of the cemetery on there. You won't often see too much in the way of embellishment. But in this case, it aptly kind of shows that replacement of the family crest that you might find on a manor house, and replacing it with this semi-martial, semi-mourning symbology that conveys the space you're moving into, but echoes that kind of English rural landscape. The gate piers are quite a common way in which the kind of Englishness of the space is established before you even enter the space. And this particular one, which is looking an awful lot bluer than it looked earlier today, when it was absolutely lashing it down with rain. This one here, this is, as it says, Edwin Lutyens and Goldsmith. And Goldsmith had worked in Lutyens' office before the war, so it's not really surprising that you can't really tell what's Lutyens and what's Goldsmith in this design. But what you have here, which I mentioned previously, which is important, is the use of the type of gate pier that within English rural life would signify you moving from the public space to the estate space, and moving to somewhere that would be considered as more important, more rarefied area than being outside. So I think that imposition of the rural hierarchy and the architecture used to symbolise that rural hierarchy is quite an interesting element to the way the Englishness of a space is imposed on the foreign land that it's within. So the gate piers are obviously a common way that it's done, but not really solely to do with Englishness. You find gate piers in pretty much any country that has a big house. So it's an interesting crossover, and one that can't be ignored. But the use of other mechanisms and other tools, it really captures the Englishness in a much stronger way, I think, than the gate piers. And the kind of first use of that is the gatehouse. Again, quite a typical estate feature on at a large estate, or a slightly grander manor house. And so the building, I've just realised that Le Trou was turned on its side there, hasn't it, for some reason. So you'll have to crane your necks slightly to see what that one's saying. But that is Le Trou aid post, again in France. And it was used as a photograph for this talk. Now, I think I won't dwell too much on the idea of the gatehouse as the as replicating gatehouses of gatehouses of country houses, etc. Because I think they play a more important role in the overall landscaping of the cemeteries. And so if hopefully this picture is the right way around. Yes, there we go, lovely. So this is the Troué post in real form rather than in the drawn form. And there are elements to it. I think initially you're struck by how beautiful it looks and how lovely it looks, and that's all very true. And then if you get under the surface of it a little bit, you'll see the gate posts again there, and the axes that takes you over the moat and the bridge through the gatehouse and into the space. But for me, it's not functioning as a gatehouse. It is a gatehouse, clearly, but its visual form is to create an English landscape prior to the space. And I'll flick between slides a couple of times here. Here is Debden Hall in Suffolk, where you can see a very similar layout, green space into bridged moat into the hall. And then if I flick back to here, effectively creating a very similar relationship between that building space. So much like we had at Carnoy, we move through a miniature England to find ourselves in the cemetery space. So again, that kind of sense of Englishness is functioning as a transitional space to ready you for the graves. Again, as another aside, bearing in mind that this is a talk, an architectural talk, there is an RA gold medalist buried in Le Trou, which is a nice kind of symmetry with selecting it as a site for such a talk. So that is a really important element to take from this, is the idea of the architecture within the cemetery acting as a void for the domestic architecture that obviously can't be there. There can't be a manor house there. And that leads me on to another point with this kind of design, is that this Englishness is not typical English cemetery architecture. This is capturing the idea of England, the idea of rural England as seen there, and imposing it onto a cemetery. So that it's not so much about creating an English cemetery, it's about recreating England and a cemetery in that England. So if you can kind of hold that thought about the void and the function of the architecture filling spaces that can't be filled with domestic architecture, we'll come on to that again a bit later. Now obviously Le Trou is very obviously creating a transitional space of Englishness, and in some cases it's not always possible to do that, but the same principles can be seen in many and various. I won't dwell too long on Heath Cemetery here. It's more just to show that this same principle of a transitional space through the kind of the tree-lined avenue into the gatehouse / manor house, and then you turn and face the graves. So it's the idea of Englishness as that kind of preparation for what you're about to enter. Now, up until now, the architectural elements we've looked at have been manor house, country house elements of things, but there's obviously one very, very important architectural element within rural England, and that's the church. Now, whilst there are the odd chapels built, or pseudo chapels built within War Graves Commission cemeteries, there's no actual churches built in there. So we don't see any of the literal church architecture. But what we do see are some of the elements that create the church space appearing within designs. And so finally a Belgian cemetery, or a cemetery in Belgium, shall I say. At Tyne-Cot, again, I wouldn't like to say if it was Baker or Truelove that designed that. I'd probably go with Baker, but it could be a combination of the two. But what we see here is a lich gate. Now, a lich gate in the English rural context was built as a covered gateway into the churchyard, where the coffin was stored and looked over until the time of the funeral. And so it was a very important transitional space from living to the dead. Now obviously at Tyne-Cot, by the time that lich gate is built, the vast majority of those buried inside are already there. So the lich gate doesn't perform the role of the lich gate in its literal sense. But what it does do is perform the function of the English churchyard and creating the idea of what you're passing into. And the materiality of the gate as well is important. The use of the dressed flint to encapture what would be, again, not a purely English aesthetic, but within the English churchyard, definitely an aesthetic you would associate with that. So it's an important element that you see. It's quite a common feature, to be honest, the lich gate across many and various cemeteries. But the fact that it's used at Tyne-Cot is quite important, because it shows something of the thinking of the creation of the spirit of place and the idea of England. Even though we know full well that within Tyne-Cot there are many and various nationalities buried within, it's the overarching Englishness of the thought process that we're looking at here. There's also an interesting kind of crossover with the use of the lich gate here, because the idea of the lich gate in this context is to create the idea of England and to project England onto the landscape beyond. Back in England, they are making lich gates into war memorials. So the memorial itself is projecting you back to whatever the foreign land is that the soldiers memorialised on it, wherever they were killed and are buried. So this one is in Edingthorpe in Norfolk, just for Roger, just outside North Walsham. This is the vicar's son was torpedoed, and that's a memorial to him. And for those of you with a literary bent, Siegfried Sassoon's aunt lived in Edingthorpe, and he visits this lich gate and talks about it in the old country, the old century, in 7 more years. So you will, it's a famous lich gate at that. But the idea of this kind of lich gates being used within the cemetery architecture to present Englishness and connect Englishness with the foreign landscape it sits within, and then lich gates in England transporting you back to that foreign landscape is, I think, quite an interesting thing to draw on. Now, with this beautiful photograph by a friend of mine, Nick Stone, which I can't recommend his website enough. If you go to Nick Stone's site, there's some beautiful writing, beautiful photographs, and like everyone here, he has a fascination with the landscapes of the Great War, and there's some really beautiful work on there. So do go and have a look at his work as well. But with this photograph in mind and finding ourselves staring at an English landscape, I think we can expand a little further on that. Again, another one for Roger here, Beeston Hall. Now, when we talk about Englishness and landscapes, there are obviously many phases, as there is in any kind of design process. But one of the earliest forms of distinct English landscape is the kind of the grand landscape of the likes of Lancelot Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. And what we see is there's a few key elements: the naturalistic planting of the trees, the controlled body of water to frame the focal point, and then raised up on the hill there, which is definitely not that much of a hill in real life, is the hall. And so what we see there is this kind of the English landscape in small form. And I think these kind of visions of England don't go amiss in the planning of the cemeteries and the way that water is often considered, particularly within the way the cemeteries are designed. And given the nature of this series and the series of talks and the kind of exhibition, it seemed rather apt that, and I apologise now because I'm going to try and speak this in how it's meant to be said. Goedebeek, is that right? Near enough, 90%. I think you can capture some of the elements of that consideration of landscape and framing of landscape to represent the transition of space from foreign field to corner of England. And if I just flick back to that piece again, you can see the very similar kind of use of naturalistic planting, the controlled, engineered body of water, and in this case, to really drag out the kind of Capability Brown, Chatsworth kind of design, a bridge as the focal point to draw you towards the ultimate architectural end, which is the cemetery, and in this case, the Cross of Sacrifice, which stands proud as the kind of marker post of this is where your focus should be, and everything else around it is the framing. You'll find this quite frequently where bodies of water are used within the cemetery, within the envelope of land which is handed over to the War Graves Commission. They are used as framing techniques quite frequently, and I think that does echo the Englishness of controlled bodies of water. Again, I'm not saying it's unique to England, but it is very English. Now, landscaping in this case obviously has to depend entirely on the circumstances of the cemetery, and each one of these cemeteries is taken on its own merits by the designers, be that the horticulturalists, be that the architects. They're all kind of considered. But in some cases where it's not possible to do this, we see kind of a later style of English garden design, and arguably the most influential on the way the War Graves Commission look, and that is the arts and crafts movement of which Gertrude Jekyll is a very prominent member. So this is the original layout drawing for Wallingcourt Holt on the, I think it's actually on the Somme, it's Pas de Calais, I think, just on the border. And this is the original layout drawing as she envisaged the cemetery to look. And more or less elements of it still exist. The thing to note is the entrance from the road here, where rather than pass through the kind of hard landscape of something like just a gateway at the roadside, Jekyll envisaged a planting nursery laid out before the cemetery, so you effectively pass through a flower garden before you enter the cemetery space. Now those of you that have been there recently, there is a nursery of sorts there still. It's not quite as decoratively laid out as Jekyll's vision for it. And I'm not sure if this was ever realised in that form, because obviously this is a October 1917 drawing, and the architecture reflects the drawing, but whether I've not been able to find any photographs that would verify if the planting ever came into being in that form. But nonetheless, the kind of thinking behind it is this, again, that kind of transition from the foreign land that is the road through an English garden and then into the cemetery space. Now, the cemetery is designed, we think, because there is some, with all these cemeteries, this is a Lutyens and Goldsmith cemetery, so there's always a little bit of toing and froing as to who's designed what, and particularly as Goldsmith, as I said before, had been in Lutyens' office, there's a kind of continuity of thought anyway. So between the pair of them, they designed the cemetery with Jekyll's planting suggestions in mind. And what I'd like to kind of briefly look at is the way in which Lutyens' use of the architecture also begins to reflect the new country houses and new country gardens that were being created just prior to the First World War. So you can see on the entrance to Wallingcourt this landscape view that's created at the end of the stone pergola that runs across the main axis, or the entrance axis of the cemetery. And this is framing a landscape that draws the eye out onto the landscape, but also brings the landscape into the hard stone. And that's a feature seen quite frequently within Lutyens' domestic architecture. And here is one such example at Hestercombe, which was also a partnership between Lutyens and Jekyll, where at the end of a pergola, this stone window looks out on looks out onto the landscape beyond, and creates that play between the architectural space and the landscape it surrounds. This is obviously another view of the entrance pergola, and that runs across the whole. If I take you back to the Jekyll drawing, that pergola runs there, and there's another one here as well. So they effectively run the full width of the cemetery. And again, I think that the kind of soft planting on these is a very Lutyens Jekyll suggestion, and it's very arts and crafts English country house that is pulled into this. And this is, of course, what's visible from the back of the nursery. If you are on the road, what you'll see is that and a flower garden before it. So if you consider that in the context of an English country garden, you end up with this kind of pergola, also at Hestercombe. So the window I showed you earlier is just at the end there. Now I would say with this photograph, this is one of the problems with taking children to sites that you actually want to photograph, because every single photograph of this particular view I had, this was the only one of my eldest son not pulling a stupid face or generally dancing around and being awkward. So a lesson to you all. Either don't have children or take photographs when they're not in the way. Or go to these places without the children. But the architectural principle is the same as you see. And I apologise for it not being a better photograph of these pergolas. but it's the same principle in that the full length of the pergola will eventually take you out onto a landscape view. So the same principles that are informing the creation of a new form of English rural idyll in the arts and crafts movement is what's being pulled through to inform the architecture of the cemeteries. Now, I'd like to look at one more cemetery before wrapping this all up. And you'd be pleased to know it is in Belgium as well. And it was also the theme, it was also a cemetery focused on by a previous exhibition here. So Bedford House. I'd be fairly stupid to be talking about the English landscape in and the idea of Englishness within a cemetery space, and not to talk about Bedford House. Now, Bedford House is a nice crossover between the theme of this talk and the theme that Dominic mentioned earlier, that my thesis research looked at, with the idea of the cemeteries capturing elements of landscape history from the war. And at Bedford House you get this crossover of the two. Bedford House obviously was originally a mansion, and a lot of the kind of geometries that you see are reflecting the history of the site, and part of the ruins of the mansion are still there as well, so they form part of it. So I won't dwell too much on this driveway other than to say that I think it still applies that there's a creation of an English landscape, even though we know it's also that the geometries and everything are actually a Belgian landscape. So we have this driveway up past the parkland, along a moat, a controlled water space again with a bridge over it, and then we come to the kind of fulcrum of the design, the cross of sacrifice in the middle, again functioning as that void that I spoke about earlier at Le Trou, where you have an architectural replacement for something. And whilst we do have the actual remains of the former chateau there, we have the cross of sacrifice and the installation of the cross of sacrifice reflecting a domestic space within which the design can work. But the elements that I'd like to kind of look at, because I think they do something different, and I appreciate that this is well within the cemetery space now. We've moved beyond the entranceway, and I will explain why in a minute. But this particular cemetery, where you've had that long drive in, you've had the parkland, you've had the water, etc., and you've had all those other features that tie in with the idea of rural and the rural idyll, and etc., etc. And then you enter the formal element of the parkland, i.e. the cemetery space. And if you look at this particular photograph, bar the gravestones there in the shade, the thing that would tell you that this is not what it initially presents as is the perimeter wall. Unless that's a very, very poorly placed ha-ha, it's not something you would see within a formal space within a country garden. And if I can just flick to this photograph, again even more so, where you can't even see the headstones on this one, you see the rotunda and the avenue. The element to this that I think is really important are the perimeter walls. And within my thesis, I discussed the importance of the height of the perimeter walls and the fact that they draw your gaze from the cemetery space out into the landscape around. These rotundas form a different function within the landscape, and because the perimeter wall is so low rather than the standard incredibly high wall that you would get around the country estate, because they're so low, they are visible across the landscape. From quite a long way away, these rotundas stand out. Not quite so much at the moment, now they're kind of green, but when they're white against the greenery of the summer foliage, they stand out for a very, very long way. And that projects the Englishness of the space onto the landscape. And I think that the perimeter walls, more so than the rotundas, are responsible for that communication of that hierarchy of spaces that I spoke about before with the gate piers. So I think to bring this to a close, the cemeteries I've taken you through, they are all creating a spirit of place, the idea of England in miniature. So we saw at Le Trou that condensing of an English landscape into the entranceway. We saw it at Carnoy, and then within these other cemeteries, picking up on specific elements of Englishness and of that rural English architectural language that was used so frequently within the kind of propaganda of what we were defending, or what the English soldiers going off were defending. I think it's incredibly interesting to look through the cemeteries and see how that thought of England can be seen within these cemeteries. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. So, time for Q&A.
Yeah.
And as is custom, I'll start right away. I was asking myself, how far is this assumption, or has this been theorized? Did someone write down we should make this probably corners of the foreign fields that are forever England, or is it just something that, by comparison, you assume?
I think there's a bit of both in it. I think we know that there was the desire to create the cottage garden theme and the sense of home, so that those visiting would feel like they weren't leaving their relatives in a foreign land. And so this is taking that idea and then looking at the visual language which is presented in just a visual study of these sites. So as I say, there's a bit of both in that we know to one level it was, but as you will know once it comes around to studying the actual architectural interventions, there's not much there. So we are left to kind of make a visual analysis of what we see.
One of the things that for me as a foreigner makes English gardens so much fun are the follies.
Yeah.
So you didn't really, sometimes it's nearing a folly, but according to you, are there follies in the cemeteries?
Well, in many respects, quite a few of the pavilions perform the function of a folly in the context of it. You have the ones that are gatehouses, but if you think at Passchendaele New British Cemetery, you have these kind of side buildings that are within the walls, and I guess they're forming a similar function. They're drawing the eye to different parts of the landscape. I think you'd have had to have been pretty brave to call anything you were putting in a cemetery a folly, though.
I think in part it's a response to your question. I think that idea of Englishness was so inherent in culture at the time, it was difficult to get away from. And what I especially see here is Englishness, not... There are villages, even at the time of the First War, that were pit villages from South Yorkshire, or even the villages on the moors. These are the South Country. Was it Belloc that coined that phrase? It sums up all of that pond and church and inn and village green. And they're a south country, it's not the north of England at all, and it's certainly not Scotland or Ireland.
So it's a very distinct version of Englishness, isn't it, that's projected? Yeah.
But it's the south.
Yeah.
Probably following on from those two questions as well, is that I was thinking about class. So all of the examples you gave us of the English, Southern English, maybe, they're manor houses.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even the lynch gate is going into a churchyard.
Yeah.
Maybe, the priest would have been higher up in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Of the. Was there any conscious, from what you said, you probably haven't come across the written records as such, but they're trying to elevate the resting places of some of these lads who probably came from the urban, the Tommy who came from the urban Manchester slums, to we're going to lay them in what essentially we want to look like in English. So have they elevated their social status almost now that they?
I think in some respects that's absolutely right. As the lady said, you're dealing with a very specific form of Englishness, and that is an Englishness that deems the rural estate space as far more important than the urban street environment, the urban factory, etc. And whilst there is nothing, I've certainly never come across anything that says that explicitly that, I think in the architectural language they're using, they are elevating these spaces and creating an estate of England within foreign land.
Yeah, because even soldiers came from rural England would have been your little huts.
Absolutely, they're not going to be used to, they might have worked in places like that, but they wouldn't have necessarily been allowed to just roam free in them, and certainly be buried within the grounds of them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. I was wondering, how much do you see that stamp of the Mark Giroud thing, the return to Camelot, that there is an Arthurian cult going on here? There's the remnants of it, and perhaps as well the continuing stamp of pre-Raphaelitism as well as arts and crafts.
Yeah, I think with the pre-Raphaelites kind of lead in quite happily the kind of Ruskin, Morris and Ruskin are very closely aligned anyway, aren't they? And then they kind of the pulled through into the arts and crafts and the Lutyens. I think that's very strong. I couldn't honestly say with the Arthurian side of things. It may be an element of that there's again you're dealing with kind of southwest England there, aren't you? But you're dealing with a certain vision of England that may be informing how it's projected onto these spaces. Yeah,
because it strikes me that something like Le Troux, you could almost imagine Frank Dix's La Belle Dame Saint Merci, the knight coming across that bridge.
Yeah, very much. Well, I mean, any use of a bridge is quite a bold statement to make, even in domestic architecture.
Yeah.
So to place it within a cemetery space, it's more than just a bridge, isn't it? It's creating that idea of England, and whether it's Arthurian or whether it's just a replica of English landscapes, then I think it's an important intervention that they might have been able to do without.
Do you know anything about the commissioning process? Were people disappointed in giving free rein to design it, or were they given a brief, or were people invited to submit designs and they were chosen by the
It's one of the great grey areas of the commission. There seems to be, from the previous research, there seems to be some connection between the Junior Architects War Service and the cemeteries they ended up designing on. And I think, just going from what written evidence there was the suggestion that the principal architects could choose a handful of cemeteries they wanted to work on, but then how the rest of them were divided, there's no hard and fast evidence that actually how that came about.
Is there anyone here from the War Graves Commission who can say whether it seems to be cottage garden planting in the cemeteries now, but is that just because the plants are cheaper?
I don't think that was at the time, I don't think that, the cottage gardens were always the influence for it, mainly because they were seen as an English form of gardening, and therefore it would create it. So you see these lovely schemes that the War Graves Commission run at the time, where they will take cuttings from a rose growing on a son's grave and send it back to the family for them to grow the same rose within their own garden. So there's that kind of lovely exchange with them. So I don't think it comes down to price then. The thinning out of the planting now might be a reflection of budget issues, but the plant choices themselves are quite well established. There's a kind of list of plants that they use.
Can I just ask a general question about gateposts?
Yeah.
I was particularly struck by the introduction, but there are several places in the local area where there are quite large gateposts, which are perhaps at the entrance to a farm, with a large, sort of track leading up to the farmhouse. And I don't know whether they were sort of collected from anywhere and re-erected as gateposts, whether it was some sort of a trend.
No, I think it was quite a common thing with any large landowner across Europe, particularly across northwest Europe. Gateposts were a symbol of wealth and power.
Walls.
Yeah, no. Well, actually at Wallingcourt Holt, if you come out onto the main road, there is a set of enormous gateposts to the farmyards that are no longer in use. There's a wood grown up around them, so they kind of sat there on their own. So it's not to say that there aren't gateposts in the rest of Europe. It's just the gateposts forming part of that kind of English landscape and the representation of England. But certainly gateposts are universal.
And so farmers may well have adopted that idea as a sort of mark of importance.
If I'm on it, the ones that get left behind are usually there because they're too narrow to get the latest tractor through. So they have to build another entrance and they leave the original gatepost behind. So you see that quite frequently. Yeah, Roger.
Just on a slightly different kind of design thing. As a lot of these designers at the time, and generals and whatever, a lot of them were kind of quite prominent Freemasons at the time. Is there any Masonic influence on some of the designs in the cemeteries that you know?
Not that I've ever come across, to be honest. I'm not really an expert on Masonic symbolism or any such. There may well be bits and pieces in there, but nothing that I've explicitly come across. No. Yeah. Well, and they're Masons, quite literally, aren't they? Any more for any more? No, I think we're done. Lovely.
Then we can conclude to thank you, Tim, for a very inspiring and interesting talk. So thank you very much. Just take 1 minute to make some promotion on future events. So the next lecture here in this educational room is the 7th of March. Then it's Jeremy Gordon-Smith who will be the guest speaker on the photography of Ivan Baldry. So if you want, there will be an announcement on the website, of course, an invitation. So that will be the fourth and last speech of the our talk of the Kent lectures of this year. You mentioned Grotebeek Cemetery. Of course, this is a very important cemetery that you can see in a role model, in our temporary exhibition on Forevermore on the military cemeteries. So it's still open until the 18th of February, 10 days I think. So if you want to see it or see it again, you can do that until next Sunday. I had to say, Mark, tomorrow you give a tour at St. George's Memorial Church.
Yes.
For at 10, 10:30. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So So everyone who is interested, just call to Mark. And I think that's all that I have to say. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And very much thanks to you for your presence, your enthusiasm and your questions. So thank you.